Hey everybody, my name is Ian. Today we're talking about Jared Lee Schmidt's May the 4th Be With You, Star Wars Day, the mass media, and a vernacular hybrid fan holiday. This is a really interesting article. A lot of it has to do with the way that this particular emergent calendar custom, and it might be kind of weird to talk about it in such profound and solemn terms, but how this emergent calendar custom is celebrated in a particular manifestation, which is online. And so, in many ways, this is an article about digital art, about whether the digital art that's produced by professionals, because he spends a lot of time talking about that Dallas television station that produced these short videos for May the 4th in 2015, or vernacularly, the rise of memes, the rise of other forms of digital expression that go alongside this occasion. And he says right at the very beginning that basically the process is too large to really do a coherent or a representative ethnographic sample of actual May the 4th celebrations, so he's looking at how it's done online, which is very cool. But it gives us the opportunity to consider. We can talk about digital culture and how memes operate and how digital fan communities actually function and express themselves and are, by their very nature, engaged in hybridity and hybridization and the confluence of things. But we should also talk about the celebration itself, why these things happen, because it deals with fan cultures. Clearly, I mean, I can't imagine anyone watching this doesn't know, but you have a movie that comes out in 1977. It introduces a certain form of not simply a narrative arc that people can become invested in, and but also a sort of an ethos in terms of the whole idea of the Force. We can look at and then sequels emerge, the beginnings of fan culture emerge, fan culture that is about possibility. One of the things that fan cultures tend to do is they first they become invested in the idea of the canon of story itself, and they want to learn as much as they can, and then most of the time. So, bearing in mind that when we're talking about 1970s fandom, we don't have the 21st century access to this material. So if you look at someone like Camille Bacon Smith's work on early Star Trek fandom and early science fiction fandom to begin with, you are dealing with people who are fans of a product that they don't have access to beyond the whims of programmers and television stations. So if you liked Star Trek, you had to be home to watch Star Trek when it happened. When it got into some kind of syndication, you had to be home when they were watching it. And Star Trek conventions, one of the things that they started doing is people very early on in the realm of home video, they created these. They would buy the massive old video recorders, record them off the television, which was a new thing, and then they would make copies of these tapes. They weren't bootlegs because I guess they functioned as bootlegs, but they weren't bootlegs for the sake of trying to really like undersell an official product. There was no official product in terms of any kind of home mediation beyond broadcast. So, and then the conventions became these places where these tapes could be traded. And then, in addition to, so you could experience, if you had missed an episode, you were out of luck. Star Wars fandom builds on that kind of fandom where people wanted the material as much as they could, and they only had screenings. It wasn't until the early 80s, so 4 or 5 years after the release of Star Wars, that home video was a possibility. Lucas didn't like it, and so you just had whatever whims that Lucasfilm and 20th Century Fox had for getting those getting those movies out and available. So fandom is about becoming invested in some kind of text, because the next stage of fandom is then creating within that fandom. Doing things like, first of all, looking at perhaps the official extra-canonical works, such as the novelizations, but also creating one's own, writing slash fiction, writing fan fiction, building, even creating indices, just creating reference works that help the fandom keep track of this. And we see this interesting reciprocity when actual creators start looking at fan-produced archives and fan-produced indices in order to keep track of themselves. There was a case with J.K. Rowling where she went to stop the publication of someone who had produced this massive encyclopedia of the Potter universe. It's one that she had consulted when it was an online archive, but she didn't want it to be published in some kind of book. So oddly, she recognized it as having a value, and particularly that her being able to seek value from it, yet simultaneously didn't want someone else to profit from it in terms of a publication. So but you have this reciprocity. And nowadays you will see people in studios at Lucasfilm, at Marvel, at even at Disney. I know they're all now interrelated, but who use fan-based resources as little touchstones in order to keep track of the canon. Canon's a good word we should momentarily think of, because canon has to do with... canon is used a lot it had been used historically in literary circles. When we talk about the canon, we're talking about, the word comes from the Greek. It comes from the Greek for a reed. So the reeds that might grow by a riverbank, which were used as rulers. So they were used as things that one measured with. And so the canon, by parallelism, becomes a measure of something. So we talk about in scriptures, we'll talk about what works are canonical, which means what they contain narrative, and they also contain basically the beginnings of church teachings, and they are the things by which additional church readings are measured. So if they do not measure up to the canonical works, they are inauthentic. We adapt this in literary circles, where we start talking about like the Western canon of literature, and basically that these are the fundamental human achievements of literary work, and so they become sort of a de facto measure against which new work is judged and deemed. We'll talk about folk song. We'll use canon as well. Basically, that the sort of what are the measures of aesthetics and so on. The problem with the idea of canon is that it's a very top-down idea, and it sort of forces this issue of authenticity and inauthenticity. So it's a questionable idea, but we do talk about it a lot in fan cultures, because we talk about things like like the Joss Whedon canon of Buffy are the 7 seasons, that 8th season, which is actually in a comic book form, and I think there's now a 9th one, and that's basically sort of what is fixed, and everything else kind of falls along outside. When Disney bought Star Wars, they basically stripped away all the sort of published fiction and all the comic books that had sort of been canonical, approved products, and more or less they wanted to start the Star Wars world from just the movies, just a couple of official ones, then introduce new timelines and so on, so that they weren't basically having to forever retcon, as it were, retroactive continuity, the universe around what had already been sort of, in some ways slipshod. Although Lucas was pretty tight about how he would do it. So, but canon is an interesting term to think about, because it's basically, it still has that what is the official sense, what are the official bounds of the stories, and then fan culture dances around that canon. They appreciate the canon. They'll talk about canonicity. They'll even use words like head canon. Is that like, as far as I'm concerned, this is now part of the it's a subjective canonicity, as it were. But so they still, at the very least, they play with that concept of canon. But what they fundamentally do is they are creating around the periphery, and they're building meaning around this text, which is not actually fundamentally different from what does happen with the idea of sort of like vernacular religious, and that you have these stories, you have sort of an official interpretation of them, and then you have a whole confluence of practices that emerge around them. And if they are not inconsistent with the official sanctified version, they are more or less sort of allowed to be, and if no one is profiting from them, and so on. So again, you have this interesting reciprocity. So basically, puns. You have the May the 4th pun. Where the first iteration of which was associated with Margaret Thatcher when she won the 1979 election. So that's weird. When a congratulatory ad in, was it the Express or the Guard? Probably the Express. So May the 4th be with you. So evidence that, first of all, it's evidence that Star Wars had entered into the public consciousness enough that someone could take that pun, or take that idea, take that proverbial expression fundamentally, whether we want to use proverb in a sort of strict sense, but at least a sort of a contained set of text, and recognize that sufficient people would understand it, that the pun would actually work. And so May the 4th happened. And then over time, and certainly in the digital age, when you started having this possibility of a digital community, so well into the 2000s, you had the beginning of Star Wars Day as something that kind of went past the actual pun into some kind of performance. You can make an argument, and people don't like the way that I'm not fast and loose with ostension, but the idea that you have this sort of sacred day, and then people actually, well, they turn it into a sacred day, and they communicate it not simply through word, but they communicate it through action. So they actually do orient themselves around this particular day as an important moment in their calendar, because these stories are important to them. It doesn't mean that they are unaware of the potential irony, but nevertheless, they are participating in a culture, fan culture, wholeheartedly. And then that becomes this opportunity that the official canonicity police, i.e. Lucasfilm and Disney, they start recognizing that this is a thing, that might be not a content that is fan generated, but an event, a moment, an orientation that is fan generated, and then they accept that to the point of they start having suggested activities that one can do. They start presenting potentially blank memes. They start creating their own memes. Meanwhile, other groups like this television station in Dallas, and so those blurbs that you might see in morning news shows, and people might start talking, May the 4th be with you, it's Star Wars Day. They will start recognizing that this is a thing, and then it becomes a thing. How long does a thing need to be a thing before it's a thing? Is really sort of one of these questions that we could be asking ourselves. So you have this process that emerges and then becomes, like all calendar customs, something around which we can orient our year. It's a momentary pause from the day to day. It is different from other days. It's marked, even if it's marked by virtue of a kind of lame pun, nevertheless, it takes on a resonant appeal. And on this day, in a similar way that on St. Patrick's Day, we are all Irish, on May the 4th, we are all not even Star Wars fans. We are all in the Star Wars universe, as it were. We momentarily take pause, and of all the various communities that we potentially belong to, this is the one that we are just drawing attention towards. And it is fun. It doesn't need to be taken. It's one of those things that, to take this process seriously, for the folklorist to look at Star Wars Day and take it seriously, does not mean that that everyone needs to take it solemnly, because it is a fun occasion. It is about play. It is expressly about play. It is recognizing that even with these texts that are important not simply because they are commercially successful or they have a broad appeal, but because people find actual meaning in them, even if it's not the same meaning as some kind of religious affiliation or national affiliation. Nevertheless, they become mandalas through which one understands one's life. So there is a serious hardcore fan community, and then there's, because of the size of the venture, there's a lot of people who are happily familiar with the texts. And by being happily familiar with the texts, they can participate in May the 4th just as easily. None of which means that we need to think of this as a solemn and profound occasion, but we can see this as a sincere instancing of the basic dynamic of calendar custom. This recognition, the annual, or whatever the calendrical cycle, but typically we're talking about the year, the annual pause from the day to day where we momentarily take the opportunity of a particular set of symbols and orient how we celebrate each other through a particular set of symbols by using those particular set of symbols. And we do something performative. We take a pause. Its specialness is brought together and reminds us that as much as things change, as much as not simply the real world changes, but also the Star Wars imaginary changes, as much as the canon and the folk canon adapt over time, nevertheless there is constancy. So we have that tension, that calendrical, the calendar custom, as ever. It reminds us of the cyclical nature of time, and that things repeat, and that repetition is an indication of continuity, despite the fact that we also exist in linear time, and stories change, and just as importantly, and actually more profoundly, people emerge and people disappear. And you want to think about that in terms of fan communities and the real parasocial bonds that we have with the people who are part of these pop culture products, and the real meaning and the real communities that are had online through participation in these. Occasionally it breaks into the real world. Obviously there are events when the movies come out, and there's events in terms of what's officially sanctioned events, there's conventions and so on, but there's also just getting together and like going down to Cineplex on the late night screening on Thursday, and like wearing a robe and running around with a lightsaber, and it's like, that's actually kind of fine. But then May the 4th becomes this moment when there aren't other moments, when there aren't necessarily conventions, when a new movie isn't coming out, a new show isn't being released, and then they can just jump onto that. Now, we do see that with Disney Plus, May the 4th becomes a launch date for Star Wars products, and so it becomes, again, that sort of feedback cycle. So it is fundamentally a fixed, officially recognized day. So I don't actually talk about Schmidt's article that much, because basically he's using it as an opportunity to introduce the reader to the dynamics of digital culture and hybridity. And he's using Robert Glenn Howard's work and Trevor Blank's work and Lynn McNeil's work and Lamont Schiffman's work, all of which is wonderful. But just thinking of this as, how do these new calendar customs emerge? How do these moments of group importance emerge that are not based in participation in a sacred narrative, that are not based in participation in a national narrative, but are based in participation in a narrative that was created within commercial circles and within markets. As wonderful as that narrative might be, we recognize it as a pop culture product, and yet it is sufficient that we have a a day that we set aside and we participate in this and we recognize, perhaps ironically, but not in that disdainful irony, but just like in a bemused, joyful, arched eyebrow. This is something that we do. This is important to us. And so, hey, may the 4th be with you, we all say to each other. Or we don't, and that's cool, because it's not a law. So, read this for a really great discussion of digital hybridity, but I really wanted to bring the idea of fan cultures and how these things are not dismissible as easily as we might imagine them to be, because they have potential economic impact, which is not a reason to dismiss it, but more importantly, for at least for my purposes, they have a real impact in how the individual relates to a larger group and the larger society, and finds a refreshment by virtue of being ongoingly by virtue of ongoingly recognizing themselves as part of this larger story. Yeah, so that's what I want to say. So, my name is Ian. Today I have been talking to you about Jared Lee Schmidt's May the 4th Be With You, Star Wars Day, the Mass Media, and the Vernacular Hybrid Fan Holiday. I hope you are well. I wish you nothing but the best, and I will see you later. Live long and prosper.